Hello and welcome. I am live from Pelham's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pelham's Wasteland Reads for you all. This time covering How to Win the Premier League by Ian Graham. I guess you probably say Graham because I think that's how the English say it. But this is a book that is about essentially the intersection of statistics and data science and football or soccer. I do not have much of a background in English football or soccer. I played soccer when I was in elementary school, and then, of course, haven't played any of that since. And I do not really particularly keep up with basically any sports, but definitely not Premier League soccer. So I went into this basically just being interested in the discussion of the intersection of data science and data analytics with sports, which is sort of the first encounter that I had with that is in Moneyball, which, if you are aware, was a book by Michael Lewis and then adapted into a movie starring Brad Pitt. Really good book and movie, totally worth checking both of those out. And Ian Graham even kind of gives a couple of nods to the concept of Moneyball and says that this is, part of why people sort of started to pay attention to this idea that you could actually do something, seriously transformative with this kind of analytics work is because of that and the way that that transformed baseball, and that you could do something with soccer that is also transformative basically on a large scale, figuring out who is overpaid or underpaid, partly because much like Major League Baseball, highest level association football or soccer does not have any type of like salary cap the way that, for instance, the NFL or the NHL both have salary caps for teams. And so part of the logic of the game is that everybody is spending basically the same amount of money on players, presumably. Whereas, part of the reason that Moneyball exists is basically because it's about the Oakland A's, who are not spending nearly as much money on their players as some of the teams that have a whole lot more money. And that's part of the story in here, is that there's a whole discussion about which teams have lots and lots of money, which teams don't have as much money, which teams can figure out how to play better football without as much money, basically, is the sort of point of the Moneyball side of it. But then there's also the sort of basic point of, well, if you can use all of this statistical information to figure out who performs better for money, you can also just figure out, who performs better in the raw sense, and figure out how to win. So Ian Graham worked for Liverpool for a number of years working on this process, and also worked for the Tottenham Hotspurs. And so the first third or so of the book, maybe 40% of the book, is his story about his kind of own experiences directly working on these processes. Maybe a little more, maybe first half of the book is about his kind of experiences working with these processes in a football club, as they call it, essentially working with all of the other members of the staff to try to figure out, who they can afford to let go, who they want to hire, who they want to transfer for, all of the different things of trying to figure out how to make their money work efficiently to win games. And that's pretty interesting. I think for me, what was really interesting is sort of as you get into more of the theoretical side, just because I don't pay very much attention to who's winning and losing soccer games. The story of Liverpool, doing really well and having a great couple of seasons, in part because of this analysis, just doesn't doesn't tug on my heartstrings quite the same way as I suppose if I were, a big Liverpool fan. I would be like, oh, that's so exciting, all of that sort of stuff. Um, but the kind of more abstract side of figuring out how to analyze a match and figuring out, how to look statistically at what is happening and to isolate the different variables as best as possible and understand, who's playing well and who's not playing as well, things like that. That to me was really interesting. And it gets into a really interesting kind of the sort of introduction and conclusion both make a point that I think is worth interrogating, where Ian Graham talks about the way that baseball has changed because of this kind of statistical awareness and makes the case that the game has gotten less exciting basically because there has been more awareness of the value of drawing walks and basically staying alive, not getting out so that the next guy has a chance to do his thing also, and that this is really valuable in many ways, more valuable than swinging for the fences and potentially striking out, even though swinging for the fences is what makes for kind of exciting plays. And he makes an interesting point that in his argument, the best game is the one that is made better by approaching it statistically and logically and analytically. And he gets into basically why he thinks that teams ought to attack in soccer, why in particular teams who think that they are better than their opposition should pretty much always be attacking. That he has some discussion of essentially the logic that if your team is better than the opposition team, if you think your team is better than the opposition team, then you ought to always, as much as possible, be trying to capitalize on that degree of being better. And so there's an interesting discussion there, but it gets into, I think, a really succinct point ultimately about, the best game is the one that is improved by thinking about it analytically. And I liked that a lot. I am not quite honestly familiar enough with high level soccer, association football at the level that he's talking about to be able to judge necessarily how that plays out in these games. But I think it is, as someone who is interested in games in general, not necessarily sports, but this idea of the game as something that comes out of, the expression of play as being partly based on the rules and the character of the players and all of these different things, that there is something really kind of interesting and very elegant about that summation, that the best game is one that is made better by engaging with it analytically. And so I thought that was pretty cool, which is why I keep talking about it basically. But the statistical stuff that makes up basically the second half is also interesting, as someone who is not super familiar with the game in general, certainly not at a high level of play. There's a lot of really interesting discussion about basically the process of this kind of statistical analysis and the insights that it can give someone who is watching from the sidelines, basically. So I think, that part of the book probably a little more. The first half has a lot of proper nouns and a lot of discussion of, very immense amounts of money being paid back and forth and all of that sort of stuff, and kind of keeping track of all that when I don't have very much background in any of that was just not as interesting to me, basically, and not as fun. But the statistical analysis of, like, we can say, okay, well, how do we actually determine like what makes for a good goalkeeper or not? That to me is really interesting as someone who is kind of interested in that type of analytical engagement with the greater world around us, whether it's in the context of games or not. So that I would say is probably, for my money, the better half of the book, or at least more closer to what I would be interested in reading more of, certainly. But yeah, on the whole, it's there's something fun about taking a piece of well-crafted nonfiction and getting into something that you didn't really know about before. And for me, that's How to Win in the Premier League. Because I don't really know much, if anything, about the Premier League. But really plenty of interesting kind of discussion of this thing that other people certainly care a lot about, even if I don't care as much about it. So yeah, I would say worth checking out if you have any interest in that type of statistical analysis of soccer, or if you are big fans of high level soccer being played and are familiar with all that. I guess it seems like this would be an interesting way to engage with that type of story, I guess. Anyway, How to Win in the Premier League by Ian Graham. Check it out if you are interested. Leave a comment down below if you have any thoughts on the matter. And otherwise, I've been live from Pelham's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.